I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us today. For those of you from outside the law school, my name is Chris Nichols. I'm a professor here at the law school, the holder of the W. Jeff Beatty Chair in Corporate Law. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this very special Business and Law Scholar keynote lecture. The Business and Law Scholars program and the Torys LLP Corporate and Securities Law Forum are made possible thanks to the generous support of donors, including the Torys LLP firm and Jeff Beatty. And we're grateful, as always, to all the supporters of the law school for their generous help and support. Through that support, we have had the opportunity of hosting here at Western Law dozens of the world's most influential business and law scholars and thought leaders, including, in addition to today's distinguished speaker, who I will introduce in just a few minutes, four other Nobel Prize winning economists: Robert Shiller, Byron Scholes, George Akerlof, and Oliver Hart. Now, before formally introducing today's speaker, I'd like to call on our Dean, the Dean of Western Law, Erica Chamberlain, to offer some words of welcome. Dean Chamberlain.
Thanks, Professor Nichols. I'm thrilled that so many of you are joining us today for this keynote presentation in our Business and Law Scholar Speaker Series. Whether you're here at Western, whether you're elsewhere in Ontario, or whether you are somewhere else across the globe. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Western University, where I am currently situated, is built on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. I know that others of you are joining this webinar from other places, and I hope that you will take the time to learn about and honor the peoples on whose traditional lands you are living and studying today. As Professor Nichols indicated, we're very fortunate to offer this Business and Law Speaker Series, and especially this distinguished presentation to you today, thanks to support from Torys LLP and the leadership of Professor Nichols. Western Law has been able to offer a Business and Law Speaker Series that is second to none, providing our students with direct access to the leading scholars, practitioners, and policymakers in the world. Indeed, as he noted, we've hosted many distinguished speakers as part of this series over the years, including several Nobel Prize winners, the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, the former US Secretary of the Treasury, and literally dozens of the world's leading scholars in the areas of law and business. And we're delighted to continue that tradition today, and thank you so much for attending. I'll now pass things back to Professor Nichols to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much, Erica. Well, it's my very great honor to welcome to Western Law, at least virtually. We've been trying for a couple of years to get you here personally, but we're happy to have you at least in this forum. Jean Tirole. Professor Tirole is honorary chairman of the Fondation Gégé Levent Toulouse School of Economics and scientific director of TSE Partnership. He's also founding member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. He's also affiliated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he holds a visiting position and where he was a professor of economics before returning to France and coming to Toulouse. He has published some 200 articles in economics and finance, as well as 12 books on a wide range of topics. His books, for example, include Theory of Industrial Organizations, Game Theory, Prudential Regulation of Banks, Competition in Telecommunications, and a book that at least my students with corporate finance are familiar with, his book on the theory of corporate finance, which I drew on regularly, I'm pleased to say. He's the recipient of numerous honors and awards internationally, including the 2014 Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. That's the prize more commonly known, of course, as the Nobel Prize in Economics. His research has had an important influence on many areas of legal research and legal theory, including competition law, contract law and theory, corporate law, corporate governance, theory of the firm, and banking regulation. His work on two-sided markets, platform markets, has particular relevance to the technology and telecommunications sector. But for those of us with an interest in open banking, which is coming soon to Canada, we're told, it's clear that this work is also going to be relevant to the regulation of modern financial institutions and financial markets. In June of this year, he chaired with Olivier Blanchard of MIT a commission of renowned international economists. They produced a work titled Major Future Economic Challenges. It was released in June of 2021. And although it was prepared for the government of France, this is a very important work which offers an insightful analysis of key issues that are relevant, frankly, to every nation. It's a little wonder then that when Professor Tirole was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2014, he was described by the prize selection committee as one of the world's most influential economists. And with that, I am now honored to call on Jean Tirole to deliver Western Law's 2021 Business and Law Scholar keynote lecture titled Markets and Morality. Jean Tirole.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for those very kind words. And thank you, Erica, and thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor to be giving this keynote. The keynote, as Chris said, is about markets and morality. And the first thing, of course, we have to discuss is what is morality? I mean, there are lots of different conceptions of morality, and we have to think about what we mean by that. Then what we'll do is to look at the link between markets and morality. I mean, in particular, our market jeopardizing the morality, and is that dangerous for moral behavior? And finally, we'll reflect on what we as consumers or investors or workers should do. So what kind of social responsibility do we have? So that's the program. I have to warn you right away that out of the 30 slides, there are 3 which involve mathematics. So at that point of time, you may want to go to sleep or complain, or else you can try to follow. If you're angry with math, you can try to follow, and I think even if you don't like math, you'll be able to follow it because of the intuition. So let me start by sharing my slides. So in principle, after all those years, all those months, I should be able to do that. Okay, so so this is about markets and morality, and let me first go into what I mean by morality. So let's see. So what is moral? One standard notion, at least among the economists and some philosophers, is do no harm. So it's about externality, in a sense, to simplify. So I'm not supposed to pollute, I'm not supposed to commit crimes. And it's a pretty universal notion of morality, and it's pretty stable over time, I would say. It's not completely, but by and large. But before we adopt this notion, I would like to warn you, and you probably have noticed already, that it's pretty restrictive. It's pretty restrictive for at least 2 reasons, and you may find more. But the first reason is that moral behavior is very fragile. Actually, by now, there's a large literature, especially in economics, but also in psychology, on what's called moral wiggle room and narrative. So the idea that flimsy situational excuses are very powerful. So here's an example that actually was the first one to be developed, and now there are many, many examples and applications of that. We like to do dictator games in economics and psychology, where an individual called the dictator can choose anonymously between 2 options. So click on option A or click on option B. And there are different consequences in terms of money. So if you click on option A, you get 6 as a dictator, but the other person, you don't know that was a person, actually, it's an anonymous experiment, will get 1. So A is a selfish option because B gives 5 to each. So you get 1 less, but the other person gets 4 more. Okay, so that's typical dictator game. You have a choice between A and B. And in the typical experiment, about 3/4 of the people choose B. So, they are willing to forego some payoff, some material payoff, in order to be nice. Okay. Now, that's well known. There have been thousands of experiments like this, but there's something called a modified dictator game, which basically uses this as a building block for a bigger game in which there are two states of nature, one and two, and they are kind of equally likely. Instead of nature one, you have the same dilemma that you faced as a dictator. So it's a choice between A, which is a selfish option, where you get 6 and the other one gets 1, and B, which is a generous option. Instead of nature 2, it's a complete no-brainer. So A is both selfish and generous, if you want. You get the maximum 6. If you choose B, you'll get 5. And the other person on top of that will get 5 instead of 1. So it's a completely no-brainer if it's instead of nature 2. You will want to choose A. Most people will choose A. Almost everyone will choose A, of course. Now, you ask people, you can click on this button and you will know for free what the state of nature is before you make up your mind between A and B. Or you can choose between A and B without knowing the state of nature, you just decide. Now, startup decision theory says, as an individual, I would like to know the state of nature, especially if I'm generous instead of nature one. So I will choose B instead of nature one and A instead of nature two, because I will choose different things in different states of nature. So just think about yourself. Do you want to know the state of nature before choosing between A and B? So they run this experiment, and the answer is that actually half of the people actually choose not to know. Even so, it's free. So, startup decision theory is that if you are better informed, that's better because you can tailor your choice to the state of nature. But here, of course, everybody would choose not to know. They choose A. They choose A because, well, I don't know, because they say that they may not have hurt the other person, which is true. Because if you're in state of nature two, choosing A is fine. Okay. And what happens is that a much larger fraction of people choose option A than if they knew that the state of nature is state of nature one. So, and that's a very bad excuse because you could have chosen B instead of nature one and A instead of nature two. So it's really a really bad excuse, but a very, very effective one. So there are other applications which are more concrete in a sense. So for example, delegating decisions to a third party. So you have a tough decision to take, like firing a worker, but you don't want to do it yourself. So you delegate to someone who actually is known to be a tough person, okay? But of course, you are indirectly responsible. So that's a flimsy excuse again. Or if you have a charity coming to your door tomorrow, you leave your house because you are afraid that you'll be forced to be generous somehow. So you avoid the ask. So now there is a lot of evidence on exactly this point. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is that, of course, not everybody agrees on this notion of morality. Forget for the moment about Kantian behavior. Some people actually think that morality is much broader than a pro-social behavior. It's a kind of avoidance of offensive behavior, more generally speaking. It's a more generally speaking of avoidance of offensive behavior that in our mind will not involve any harm to anyone, but according to their proponent will violate conventions, taboos, generate disgust, create a feeling of disrespect for one's value. So there are those people who have this kind of broader morality in mind. They will be talking about duty or authority or loyalty to the in-group. Now, at least for economists, we think of duty as authority, as loyalty to an in-group, not necessarily as a bad thing, but it's an instrument. It's not a goal per se, okay? And this kind of morality fluctuates, I guess, I mean, it's just rough, much more over time across culture. And think about life insurance, for example. For centuries or millennia, it was thought of as a bet on life and therefore to be immoral. Think about gay marriage. The many people for a long period of time thought that was immoral in some way. But then you can ask, where is the harm? Where is the anxiety? And that's really a question. So, and of course, there's no limit to that. I mean, we already saw the examples of life insurance and gay marriage, but more generally, everything can become harm. So if I disagree with you, for example, then of course it's mental harm against you, and then I should never disagree with you. So it's kind of pretty broad concept. The dividing line is not obvious, of course. So let me talk. I guess there are a few economists in the room, but let me talk about the economist Weltanschauung, the world view of economists. And it's fair to say, also it's not quite correct, that they will emphasize on incentives. So incentives are key if they are properly applied. So of course, many of us, not only economists, of course, have been working on caveats to that. So there's been a lot of work in the last 30 years on what's called low power incentives. So basically not giving too much incentive to economic agents. And that shows up, for example, when you have noisy performance measurement, because of course, performance doesn't basically reflect effort, for example. That's in particular the case in teams where only aggregate performance is observed. That happens when you collude with monitors or you capture a regulator, when you have repeated interaction, when you have multitasking, when you have adverse selection. So those are things which have been well developed in the past 30 years. And you may even have crowding out. So crowding out is when you have a downward sloping supply curve. So basically that means that you raise the price and the supply goes down. So in that case, incentive do not have a weak effect, have a negative effect. And the work I've done with Roland Benabou on that, we showed there were two cases in which that may be the case. The first is the informed principle, where the principle, by giving incentives, conveys bad news about the difficulty of the task or something like that, and reduces the intrinsic motivation of the agent. Or there can be multidimensional signaling, or what psychologists call the over-justification effect. And those are big words. Just to say something simple, is that if I'm being paid for being nice, then you don't know whether I'm just a nice person or I'm greedy and doing it for the money. Okay, and then you can have crowding out in that case as well. Despite all those caveats, it's still fair to say that we economists have this view that incentives work, and if you apply them well, that's good. So, and also we think that markets often fail. I mean, we often work on market failures, but if we regulate them properly, then they are the key to the economic organization. Now, this view is not always shared by other social sciences. So, and the one I'm going to discuss in a minute is philosophers. Now, the sociologists and psychologists, they will, of course, mention the crowding out phenomenon. There are many legal scholars in the room and students, and they have emphasized that the law is not just a set of incentives or sanctions, but it's also expressive. So it's going to express the values of society. And I completely agree with that. But where the dialogue has become more difficult is with some philosophers, not all philosophers, of course, where there's a lot of distrust of markets which have been expressed. Markets and incentive, of course, market is a specific incentive with very different point of view. So, you take two books which have almost the same title, Michael Sandels from Harvard and Deborah Satz from Stanford, but I could also add Michael Walzer from Princeton, Elizabeth Anderson, and so on. I mean, we've written similar books. And they differ also the theme is the same, the title is almost the same, and they're also saying, watch out, markets can be dangerous. Their conclusions are quite different, but somehow there's this view that economists get it wrong. Somehow they get it wrong with their emphasis on excess emphasis on certainty. So that raises a key issue, at least for me and other economists, which is economics a moral and philosophical science? And surprise, surprise, I'm going to try to say yes, it is. So in the book, sorry about the advertising, but in the book I wrote a couple of years ago, in one of the chapters, I tried to argue that a number of what we call repugnant markets can be analyzed in terms of very standard things in economics. The first is externalities, especially if you broaden the concept of externality to include image externalities. So for example, if you think about prostitution or dwarf tossing, then there's the idea that the person may, and not always, of course, but may actually accept doing it for money. But doing it actually conveys a bad image on women, on small people, and so on. Actually, there's a very interesting court decision in France, like 25 years ago. The Supreme Court basically talked about image externalities to prohibit one such thing, which was the tossing of small people in nightclubs. Internalities is when we are too impatient, so we go against our own interest. So for example, we take drugs, or we click without looking at privacy issues, and we eat fat and sugar and so on. I mean, all the present bias preferences. And then there are other examples which are given, which have to do with non-competitive markets. There are examples which are given by Michael Sandel on asymmetric information. So, two examples given by Michael Sandel is, we shouldn't be paying for friendship. And, an economist will say, of course, we should not be paying someone to be a friend, because then you'll never know whether the person is a friend. Same thing, you should not be paying for, a scientific price, because otherwise this scientific price will have no value anymore, and so on and so forth. So there are actually a number of those repugnant markets, which are just very standard market failures. And I think it's important to make the distinction, because in the end, you have to understand why we don't like it. Why do we don't like the market? If you want to fix it, you really have to understand why we don't like the market. And furthermore, I don't like indignation. So indignation is a good warning signal, right? So it's a warning. When I feel indignant, I say, I should maybe look into it. But that's it. I think, just building more postures on indignation is not a good idea. After all, that's, I was talking about gay people, for example. In some countries still, but also in the past, people were very indignant against that. Now, why? They would not say why. It's just that they didn't like it. So it's a very dangerous approach to be indignant. As I said, it should just be a warning signal in a sense. Okay, so that's my views on that. Another point I want to make is that we have to think about the counterfactual. So markets always exist, whether we like them or not. So the issue is not to assume a weather market and hope they don't exist. They do exist. And in general, they migrate. If you prohibit them, they are going to migrate toward untaxed and unregulated underground markets, which can be even worse, actually. But more generally, you have to think, what is the alternative? So, is that a better alternative? What is that a worse? Or is that waiting in lines, or drawing lots, or an administrative approach, or corruption, or war? There are various ways of allocating goods, right? Which competes with markets. So we really want to think about what's the counterfactual. We cannot talk about the morality of markets if we don't talk about the morality of the counterfactual. Okay, so let me move on to the next item, Item number 2. This is joint work I've been doing with Mathias de Watripon, who is a professor of economics at Université Libre de Bruxelles, a free university in Brussels. And we try to understand whether markets can weaken our moral compass. Okay, so as I said earlier, public opinion, politicians, religious leaders, and philosophers, and so on, they warn us against the religions of the marketplace, maybe rightly so. But also there is some recent experimental evidence on what's called the replacement excuse. So the replacement excuse is a very familiar excuse of saying, if I don't do it, someone else will. Okay, so it's a very consequentialist kind of point of view in which, basically if I don't do it, anyway, somebody else will do it, so I might as well do it. So for example, I mean, we use this excuse ourselves, of course, but saying a country selling weapons to a dictator. Okay, I know it's not nice to sell weapons to the dictator, but it doesn't change anything because they will get those weapons from somewhere else, or nuclear power from somewhere else. Doctors who were selling opioids were saying, well, sure, but so they could find those opioids elsewhere. People who bribe, especially in less developed countries, they bribe officials. They always say, "Oh yeah, if I don't do it, someone else will do it, and I won't get the market." Same thing, athletes who take illicit drugs, performance-enhancing drugs, also saying that if they don't do it, they will lose anyway. So that's not fair. Okay, so this entire reasoning is that if you have very intense competition, then bad behavior lose their moral overtones because you have to do it, and they become a part of the cost of doing business. Okay, so that's as a way of an introduction. And what we are going to do is to think about how the nature of competition affects the market's morality. So the nature of competition will be, of course, the market structure. So the number of firms in the market, how close those products are in the product space, so are they substitutable? But it's going to hinge on various other things that I want to introduce. So the first thing is whether prices are flexible or fixed. I mean, you are going to say in markets, prices are flexible. Well, often, but often not as well. So if you think about taxis or doctors in most countries or notaries, their fees are regulated. So they don't have any flexibility on the price. Franchises may also have regulated prices. Some apps have regulated prices. They are regulated by the platform. And then a last case of a fixed price, so the lack of flexibility of prices, is what I call the zero lower bound. This is not macro, but it's a zero lower bound on price in two-sided markets, which Chris mentioned earlier. So, we use the goods and services of many platforms, the services of many platforms. So when you go to Google, you get YouTube, you get Gmail, you get Waze, you get everything for free. So you are at the zero lower bound. I mean, they would want to charge negative price, but of course it's not feasible because there will be arbitrage. And more generally, on the web, consumers get most of the services at price zero. Okay, so all those are examples where prices are not flexible. Then an important thing that is going to matter for what follows is whether when you cut a cyclical corner, it actually boosts demand, which is all the examples I gave you so far. But sometimes it may also reduce your cost, your unit cost of operation. So think about polluting or using child labor in a less developed country. Those are things which reduce your costs, actually, right? And actually unlikely to to increase your demand. Actually, they may actually reduce your demand if consumers are socially responsible. That's going to depend on, that brings me to the next item, the social responsibility of stakeholders. And finally, the ethics of your rivals. So there might be rivals in the market who are more or less ethical, and there might be also not-for-profit. By the way, the interesting thing for not-for-profit is that in some region, it's also going to be an instance of fixed prices, because you will have to adjust your price to the cost. You'll be constrained if you don't want to lose money. Okay, so here we are with a little bit of mathematics. So either you go to sleep, but I would not advise that, because I think that even if you don't like math, you can follow the model pretty easily. So what I'm going to do is to consider an oligopoly with n firms, okay? And each firm is going to choose two variables. The firms it's going to choose a price, at least if the price is not fixed or regulated. And then very importantly, it's going to choose a moral action, AI. So each firm I is going to choose a moral action. So a small bribe, a big bribe, no bribe, or no opioids, a little bit of opioids, a lot of opioids, whatever you want, okay? And the more moral the action, the higher the social welfare, which is associated with the action, okay? So that's a parameter of morality. If you want to do good, you have to choose a higher action, higher morality action. Now, in some cases, as I mentioned, the moral action may also affect the cost. As I said, polluting or using child labor is going to reduce your cost. I mean, that's actually why some firms do it. And therefore, the unit cost of production, when you serve a consumer, is going to increase with the morality of the action. So taking a moral action is going to be expensive. Otherwise, it will be a no-brainer. Now, so far, I guess you have followed, even if you are angry with math, the thing which is still simple but a little bit more difficult to follow is the notion of a net or total price, whatever, which is that the consumers, they may take into account other things than the price itself. They may also care about the moral action, okay? So in general, the demand function will depend both on the price you charge, but also on your moral action. I will give you examples in a minute, okay? So we write the demand function as a function of the net price of firm I, the net prices of the other firms, okay? And something which is important is the elasticity of demand, because when you have more competition, you have a more elastic demand, which means that the demand reacts more when you lower your price or when you pander to the consumer. So this net price is a difficult part. Let me just explain it a little bit better. So the net price can either increase or decrease with a moral action. So the example I gave you at the start, which is that when you took an immoral action, by the way, I use moral or ethical in the same, for simplicity, in the same meaning. So if you bribe, of course, you have a higher chance to get the contract with the official. If you ever prescribe opioids or antibiotics or sick leave, then you'll get more people coming to your, if you're a doctor, you get more customers. If you are willing to sell weapons to dictator, of course, you get the business of dictators. And there's a last thing which gives you exactly the same result, but it's slightly different twist, is if you misrepresent your product to make it look good, it also increases demand. Okay? So those are cases in which basically, if you choose a moral action, the customer doesn't like. So it increases the price. So here is an example. So on top of the price, the net price actually adds the moral action. So if you take a more moral action, the consumer won't like it and will consume less. Now, the opposite case is a case in which you have a consumer who likes fair trade or whatever, and is willing to pay actually more for an ethically produced good. So this consumer is socially responsible. So the important thing is that the net price now is going to be smaller when the action is more moral. So if I don't pollute and I don't use child labor, you're more likely to buy my good. So that's what I did here by saying, okay, the consumer internalizes alpha C will be the internalization coefficient, the welfare impact of this good. So you are hurting children or you're hurting the planet, and this is the cost of the moral action in a sense. So this is very important to understand whether consumers are socially responsible or socially irresponsible, because this is going to have a big implication for how the firms do. And finally, in economics, we usually consider what's called socially neutral consumers that just care about the price. Okay, so what is a moral issue? So just to rehash a little bit what I said in a different way. If you have irresponsible consumers, so that means their demand increases with immoral behavior, you have three foundations. The first is an externality. So if you sell weapons to a dictator, of course, there are externalities on neighboring countries. If you sell bribe, if you give a bribe, it's clearly bad. There is an externality and so on. An internality is a case of opioids. Okay. And then you have shrouded attributes or product misrepresentation. So for example, when you give the wrong fat and sugar content, okay, you declare it's lower than it actually is. Okay. So those are the three possible foundations for irresponsibility of consumers. And as I said, the foundation for responsible consumers is fair trade. So the consumer actually wants welfare to be. And that's, I think, my last slide with mathematics. And you'll be able to wake up for those of you who don't like it. So just to understand the firm's objective function, what is the assumption on corporate social responsibility? So we assume that the firm cares about the profit. So profit is price minus unit cost times demand faced by firm I. That's a standard economics, if you want. And what's new is social preferences. So you assume that supplier I internalize a fraction alpha I of whatever welfare he or she perceives, which may depend on the vector of net prices and also the vector of actions, moral actions, which are chosen by all the firms. Okay, if I put in bold, that means it's a vector. Okay, and that accommodates actually several different cases. So for example, you might care about ethical welfare. So think about that as being total pollution or total consumption of opioid. So you will have DI consumers, that's your demand curve, and the welfare impact will be WI of AI. And then the other people will have, the other suppliers will have demand DJ, and then you'll have an impact WJ of AJ. Sometimes it could be narrower, actually you just consider the welfare corresponding to your own consumer, or sometimes it could be broader and include the full welfare, which when you have asymmetric equilibria also include the misallocation of consumer to firm, which means that the consumer may not choose the firm they feel closest to, right? So I'm not going to go through that. Actually, we are rewriting the paper. I'm really sorry. I've changed the notation relative to the paper, and because we are rewriting it. So in a couple of months, you'll get the version. I apologize about that. Okay, so now let's come back to the morality of markets. So we ask, does an increase in competition erode moral behavior? So if you increase the elasticity of demand, maybe there is entry, maybe there is increased substitutability. Does it result in less moral behavior, which is basically the main message in the matter of civil society, of a number of philosophers, and many others who think that markets are immoral. And the first result we get actually surprised us. Maybe we are not clever in it, but we were a bit surprised by that, is that very often actually competitive pressure is irrelevant. So that means that more choices are independent of the demand function. So whether you're close to being a monopolist or close to be perfect competitors, you'll get exactly the same moral behavior. So the same AI, if you want, in the model. Now, the conditions for that, there are always conditions, of course, but the conditions for that are one of the two. So the first possible case is where you have flexible prices. And the second case is where you have fixed prices, but the moral action affects the cost and not the demand. You have socially neutral consumer, and the moral actions are like pollution or child labor. Okay, so that gives you a class of situations in which the conventional wisdom looks wrong. Okay, which doesn't mean that it might not be correct for other situations, and I'm going to come to that. So I'm just going to do A. So if you have flexible prices, and that's very important to understand, if you have an increase in the elasticity of demand, okay, when you have an increase in elasticity of demand, so you have more competition. So if you suppose that you have demand side benefits of cutting ethical corners. So that's the first example I gave you, like a bribe or opioids or something like that. If you cut ethical corner, you increase demand, but you increase demand more if there is more competition. You take bigger market share, extra market share, by cutting ethical corner because you pander to the consumers. Okay. So that suggests that actually the conventional wisdom should be right. It should be right because you cutting ethical corner actually give you a higher increase in market share, so that's an inducement to cut ethical corners. But there is a second effect which actually completely offsets the first effect, which is that if you have a lot of competition and you have flexible prices, then the firms will compete in prices toward marginal cost. So they will choose more competitive prices, which means that the markup will be smaller. But what's the point of getting market share is to apply it to markup. And if you have a smaller market, if you have a smaller markup, you have less incentive to gain market share. You prefer to behave more morally. So actually, what we show is that those two effects perfectly offset. Okay. So that raises a question about this conventional wisdom. When does competitive pressure matter? So that suggests looking at fixed prices. I mean, again, it might look anecdotal. It's not, because I gave you a number of examples in which actually prices are regulated or they're constrained by the zero bound or something like that. And then, this reduced markup effect of intense competition disappears because, if you increase competition, it's not going to lower price. So if you have irresponsible consumers, so if immoral actions actually boost their demand, then the result is that more competition is going to impede moral behavior. And this is exactly the idea that if I don't do it, someone else will. Actually, we show that the moral choices are strategic complements. So strategic complements in the jargon of economics basically says, if you do more of it, I will do more of it. I want to do more of it. So if you cut ethical corners, for example, then you are very competitive. You increase the elasticity of demand. And that means that I'm under a lot of pressure and I'm going to cut ethical corners on top of that. There's a second effect, which is less obvious, which we call the social responsibility effect, which is if you are less ethical, then have a social responsibility actually to take market share away from you because I don't want consumer to be exposed to immoral behavior. So in any case, if you have irresponsible consumers which correspond to some applications, then the conventional wisdom is correct if you have fixed prices. But if you have responsible consumers, those are consumers whose demand increases when you behave more morally, then more competition will foster more behaviors. Actually, and that's very intuitive. I mean, think about consumer social responsibility. If you have more intense competition, that means consumers have more choice. So they can choose the most moral supplier. So again, we don't get irrelevance here of the intensity of competition, but it can go one way or the other. So that also creates some difficulty with the conventional wisdom. And finally, what we do in that paper is to look at a different reason for why you may have fixed prices, even so they will be endogenous here. So if you have supplier with different ethics, so they have different internalization of social welfare, or they have different corporate forms. So some of them are for profit, some of them are not for profit. Then what's going to matter is that the more ethical firms or the not-for-profit ones will, at some point, if competition is intense, bump into the non-negative profit constraint. They cannot lose money. That's the assumption. So in that case, prices are endogenous, but they are akin to fixed prices because you cannot lower your price below your unit cost. Okay. So we get some interesting results, but I'm lacking time a little bit, and I would like to cover the third item. For example, we get two-sided mimetism. So for example, when competition is intense, for-profits mimic the not-for-profit low price. I mean, the not-for-profit charge unit cost, so they don't have a markup. So the for-profits basically mimic the price of not-for-profit. But conversely, the not-for-profits mimic the for-profit unethical behavior because they have to keep market share. And that's the case where competition, when immoral behavior increases demand. So demand side benefit of immoral behavior. And the thing is that if the not-for-profit doesn't mimic the for-profit, it's not going to have any market share anymore. So the outcome of competition is not going to be optimal in any sense. It's true that you will get low prices, but you will get very unethical behavior as well. So that's important to think because we think about, for industries like the health industry or the school industry, we think of not-for-profit or universities for that matter, not-for-profit as perhaps being a good outcome. And there are caveats which are discussed here. Okay, so last question about this I want to mention. Again, we have demand side benefits. Sometimes the relevance of competition applies, and I gave some examples here, and that seems to be fine because you have kind of fixed prices and basically bad behavior boosts demand, fine. But then you have cases where the theory has a hard time explaining what's going on. So think about bribing an official. So then the bidder, when bribing an official, chooses both a bid and a bribe. Okay, so the bid is a price and the bribe is the ethical behavior, unethical behavior. So in principle, the intensity of competition should be irrelevant. So if it's relevant, that means that actually the replacement excuse is a real excuse. So it's a flimsy excuse, just like the moral wiggle room example that I gave you at the start of the talk. Okay, And same thing for opioids, selling opioids, if in the case in which the doctor's fee is market determined. Okay, so third item, so we are going to move on to the third item, which is what about our social responsibility? How should we think about it? And I would like to start with a puzzle. By the way, Chris or Erica, how long should I take for that section?
Well, right now we're just at about 1 o'clock. So I'd say perhaps, 10 to 15 minutes more.
Yeah, I'll try to do in 10 because I would like to have some questions that
Okay.
and have a discussion. That would be nice. Okay, so let me start with this weird thing that our societies are more or less built around the shareholder value. Of course, we have not for profits, we have other things. But by and large, there is free entry into corporate form. And we see lots of shareholder owned corporation, and it's completely dominant in the sense, debt holder getting control rights in case of distress, but by and large, the same. So the standard rationale for that is that the shareholders' stake is very fragile and could be expropriated very easily by insiders or more general stakeholders. That's correct. That's correct, but at the same time, it's also correct that the other stakeholders are affected: the workers, the suppliers, the local communities, potential pollutees, the debt holder, and so on. And that's really a puzzle, that we have this pattern of shareholder value. And relatedly, the Milton Friedman argument that actually the goal of a corporation should be to maximize profit. Okay. Now, as you know, to protect stakeholders, there are two ways of doing that. You can do that through a contract. Okay, and that's a caution view of the world, which is relevant to some extent. So what you can do is to insulate stakeholders from managerial decisions, so protect them against decisions that will hurt them. And you see some of that. So for example, debt holders, they will get fixed nominal claims. So they are not sensitive to the performance of the firm, at least on some range, unless you have default. So you have fixed debt, and to make them even more safe, you have priority, you have collateral, and so on. Same thing for the workers. You have fixed wage and severance pay, and so on. And of course, unemployment benefits. So protecting the stakeholders. Another way to protect the stakeholders is to create exit options. So for workers, it could be general training that lets them find a job if they are fired or unemployed. For debt, it might be short-term debt maturities and the like. So you protect stakeholders because maximization of profit may not be good for all those stakeholders. But there is only so much that contracts can achieve for the reasons which are very familiar now. So that's why actually, we think of that as, this contract is still the market in a sense, but our societies are organized around Smith and Pigou. So the shareholder value approach rests on two pillars. The first is the efficiency of the invisible end of the market. So the idea is to harness self-interest in the pursuit of efficiency. That's Adam Smith. By the way, Adam Smith has done much more than that, actually, and actually is closer to Pigou than this suggests. And then there is this issue that are market failures, so there are externalities and internalities, asymmetric information, and the like, and of course, inequality too, because I think of inequality as being a market failure, because behind the veil of ignorance, we would not want this kind of inequality. But anyway, the idea is that the state is going to correct the market failures. The problem, of course, as you all know, is that it's not only that markets often fail, the government also often fails. And that's sad, because otherwise we'll be done. The government will do everything for us. Now, the government will fail. I'm going to go fast because you already know that, because it may be captured by lobbies, interest groups, um, because it panders to the electorate, misunderstanding and prejudices. It may not be able to regulate when the production is abroad, and so on and so forth. And there could be, of course, sometimes high transaction costs of regulation. And you see all of that in action, but think about the very low carbon price we have now. For 30 years, we have been knowing for 30 years that climate warming could be a disaster, and we have done very little, and we are very reluctant to have a decent carbon price, except a couple of countries. It's huge government failure, huge government failure. So that brings me to corporate social responsibility, which is something that lots of people have been working on lately, of course. And this part will follow some work I did with Roland Benabou a while ago. In a sense, corporate social responsibility, or more generally, individual social responsibility, results from this double failure of markets and governments. At least that's my view. Governments are not correcting markets, so civil society has to do it. Okay. Now, in that paper, we develop 3 views on corporate social responsibility. The first is a win-win view. I mean, to be honest, the first time I heard this expression win-win, doing well by doing good, I kind of laughed, because I said, well, who is crazy enough to lose money to do something bad? There may be people like that, but I don't know many people like that who like actually to both lose money and be immoral. If you want to give content to that, a better way to do it is the short-term or long-term view of corporate governance. And it's true that we often see measures to be short-term. They maximize their short-term performance at the detriment of future performance, which means that they don't maximize intertemporal profits. Maybe because they get a bonus, maybe because they get a carry concern, maybe because they want to run the biggest firm or whatever. So, for example, they might skimp on safety or on pollution control. By doing that, they make more money today, but of course, that's a time bomb. And of course, corporate social responsibility is about then taking a long-term perspective and intervening on the board of director and the General Assembly to actually impose a long-term perspective on the management. Okay, and that may also protect third parties. So if you think about safety or pollution control, it's also protecting the stakeholders. It's kind of correlation between the two. Okay, this is perfectly fine. Actually, a number of sovereign funds, for example, will mention that. And that, for me, it's just profit maximization. It's just intertemporal profit maximization, which is fine, and of course fine. The second concept of corporate social responsibility is what we call delegated philanthropy. So there, the firm is a channel for the expression of citizen values. So, when I go to Starbucks, I'm willing to pay a couple of cents more to get fair trade coffee. Okay, so I internalize what I discussed earlier. I maybe internalize, the welfare of some other people. If the price difference is not too large. Okay, but same thing with green funds. You might say for the socially responsible investors, you're willing to tolerate a slightly lower return if actually the investment is good for society. And many people work for an NGO at a salary which is lower than what they could get elsewhere because they get this satisfaction of actually doing good. Okay, and what the corporation does is not engaging in philanthropy. directly, it's basically doing it on behalf of the stakeholders, the workers, the investors, and the consumers. I will say, most of it is profit maximization again, because Starbucks can charge you a bit more for the coffee anyway. So it's going to pay the input a little bit more, but it's also going to charge you more for the output. Okay. And finally, the third concept is real philanthropy, in which, which doesn't mean that the other two are wrong, not at all, but in which actually there's a profit sacrifice by being nice. Okay. And I will finish with 3 informational challenges for those second and third visions. And the biggest challenge is, of course, free riding, which I kind of hinted at, which is I'm willing to pay a little bit more for my coffee if it's as good, but if it's twice as much or 3 times as much, I may not do it. So I'd rather free ride. I expect other people to do it for me. Kind of thing we see with global warming, right? So the difficulties in terms of information, leaving aside free riding, is first data collection. So you have to go along the value chain and see what all the subcontractors are doing in terms of performance with workers, with pollution, with all those things. Then you have to aggregate. And one of the difficulties is that behavior is multidimensional. So Starbucks will do fair trade coffee, but Starbucks will also do tax optimization. As a European, I kind of resent that. Also, maybe with the new Biden administration, that may go away at some point. We never know. But how do I aggregate that? So I like if Starbucks actually pays the workers more and the coffee more, but I don't like it if Starbucks evade even legally taxes, right? Then the valuation is complex. So when is that useful for society? Well, take, for example, greenhouse gases. If you remember the Kyoto Protocol, the investment was meant to be additional. But this is very important because that's the difference between posture and impact investment. So very often people invest in things which actually don't change anything because of leakage, because of various other things. And following Peter Singer's, we want impact, not posture. And that's very important if you think about ESG criteria, the application of ESG criteria. Of course, we all agree with ESG, but the application is much harder. Okay, and that raises the issue of what is socially responsible. We may have different values, but also the general point is that CSR inherits the strengths and the weaknesses of democracies. Okay, so that's what I was mentioning earlier. People may be meaning well, but they may not understand a lot of different things. I could give you some example later on, but it's kind of complicated. So those are all the challenges for corporate social responsibility and ESG investment. So let me stop there. I'm sorry I've spoken so long, but again, it's an honor for me to be giving this keynote. And I really want to thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I would invite people to post their questions in the question and answer section on the bottom bar. And we do have a few questions now, and I'll read them first. And I think this arises from the analysis you were doing of the conditions under which competition would or would not lead to pro-social behavior. How does a business or a supplier determine if their consumers are responsible or irresponsible, since that's obviously key to knowing whether or not the market in which you're operating is going to lead to pro-social or anti-social behavior? How could a firm do that?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. It's It depends on the situation. So it's basically, you know it when you see it. So I was talking about Starbucks with fair trade coffee. No Canadian citizen is going to benefit directly from a fair trade policy. Now, you may be willing to pay a little bit more for fair trade coffee. So in that case, you are socially responsible. And so that will be that case here. Um, Whereas if you're a doctor and you want to, and in France, for example, if you go to doctors and you ask for a sick leave, even if you're in good health, the doctor will sign a sick leave because the doctor knows that if he doesn't do it, then some other doctor will. And same thing with antibiotics. There is a huge overconsumption of antibiotics. Many consumers, many patients ask for antibiotics even when they don't need that. But the doctors sign and say, why don't you take an antibiotic? So that's one case in which the consumer is socially responsible. So it really depends on the situation. And when you see the situation, you know in which case you are.
Okay. Second question, and this one's coming from my colleague Alan Miller, a law and economics scholar here at the law school. Have you considered the effect of anonymity on market participants on the morality of their behavior?
That's another good question. Unanimity actually raises the issue of pivotality, right? So if you are rational and there's a decision, you should put yourself in the state of nature in which basically everybody else has voted in favor, because then you are the one who decides, right? If someone has said no already, then your vote doesn't matter anyway. So it's only when everybody else has voted yes that you are pivotal. So you may change the decision. You may choose between yes and no. And that's going to be the decision. So if you are a rational player, you should put yourself in a situation in which everybody else has voted yes.
Right.
Now,
sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I may have not expressed the question.
Okay.
The issue he was looking at was not unanimity, but rather anonymity when
Oh, I'm sorry.
when people are anonymous. Yeah.
Well, let me finish with the unanimity because that's sorry about that. Unanimity is basically people often don't think they're actually pivotal, and they have this excuse that actually somebody else might have voted no anyway. And actually, there is a lot of evidence actually in the moral wiggle room exactly to that effect. I'm sorry to have misunderstood the question. Anonymity. So anonymity, and the question was, what does anonymity do for moral behavior?
Right. What's the effect of anonymity on market participants on their morality?
Okay, there is a lot of evidence, both in the lab and in the field, that if behavior is anonymous, then people behave less pro-socially, as you would expect. So, if people are watching you, you are more moral in terms of your behavior than if people don't watch you. And that's a very, very consistent fact which has been established in those experiments.
We have a question now that relates to how you fix a particular incentive problem. So here's the question. When managers of a firm take short-term actions that benefit them personally, for example, bonuses, they get away with it because others, investors, go along with it. Investors ride along with the short-term stock price increases, for example, knowing, or I guess I'll add my editorial note, at least believing they can get out in time before the ticking time bomb explodes, leaving the consequences to others. The example that the questioner gives is Boeing. Suggests that in 2010, Boeing made shareholders happy and drove up the stock price, but now it seems that They've forfeited leadership in the commercial airline industry. And there are also issues recently that have been raised in press reports that we know about relating to potential safety problems. So employees, naive investors, the state of Washington's economy suffers. And so the question is, given all of this, how do we fix that incentive problem?
Okay, so that's the issue is how do you control this short-term behavior? So we are back to item number one on the list of corporate social responsibility. So the difference between short-term and long-term behavior. So why is that people behave, managers sometimes choose the short-term option? And of course, yeah, the stock price may go up because of course there is a signal extraction prime, which is that the market doesn't know whether those are good news or it's just kind of fake and kind of short-term behavior. So now you have to go back to the reason why managers may do that. They may do that either, as you mentioned, to get a bonus, and they just want the money right now. So you don't have enough delayed compensation, which give a long-term perspective. You don't have clawbacks or things like that. So that's one thing. But then there are also even if you don't have monetary incentives like that, like bonuses and stock options, you may also have career concerns. And that's not specific to managers. We see sometimes scientists, for example, in academia, cheating on, changing the data and so on to publish something striking in Nature or Science, because they want to become famous or they want a top job or whatever. That's not for the money; it's for the glory, or often. But that's the kind of thing that induces them to actually. So on the first item, which is a monetary incentive, one thing you can do was already mentioned. You can basically have, restrict bonuses and have more long-term compensation, have clawbacks and the like. On the other thing, it's harder because, of course, you have to detect fraud at some point or short-term behavior. You have to detect it, and that's where governance plays a role. So the governance of the firm or the governance of a profession plays a big role in keeping people on their toes. And that's really what has to be done. I mean, you yourself, Chris, well, it's a delicate balance. Actually, achieving that is actually quite difficult. But it's a mixture of structuring incentives better and then monitoring better.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the questioner was the concern they were raising is that although there are these tools to try to improve managers' incentives, the people who would, I guess, monitor the monitors, for example, investors, may not themselves have the incentives necessary to impose those sort of disciplines on the managers. Exactly. For various reasons. The next question regarding the profit maximization, social responsibility of companies. How would regulations evaluate the short-term and long-run benefit trade-off? So, for example, if a fund manager decides to maximize short-run profit at the cost of high debt and credit accumulation and leave a high liquidity and credit risk in the future after she or he is retired, how do you identify the morality of that sort of behavior? And how would that sort of risk be prevented by regulation?
So yes, I mean, there is a moral issue there because, as you said earlier, this short-term behavior is going to create some damage on communities, on workers, on creditors and the like. So it's going to be extremely expensive for society. So the first thing, what we would like to happen is, of course, that the manager himself or herself will actually not engage in this kind of behavior, but will feel a moral duty not to. But as we know, that doesn't always happen. And at some point you have to regulate. So, think about banking, for example. Lots of there's more and more attention which is paid by banking regulators on liquidity issues. So actually, with Basel III, we have introduced a liquidity coverage ratio on top of the solvency ratio, just to try to make sure that the banks will not gamble and make a lot of profit in the short run, at the detriment of, profitability, and giving rise to bailouts, for example, by the government. So that's one thing you can do, is to try to, but again, it's getting into the governance and trying to make sure that the behavior doesn't occur. The other possibility is to have, clawbacks and, make sure that the manager doesn't get any money until, a couple of years. Of course, if the manager wants to retire, that may create some difficulties, but, at some point that it's a delicate thing.
The next question I have is from my colleague here at the law school, Professor Martin Petrin. What would you say your research suggests on how management should handle conflicting interests between shareholders and others, consumers, for example, or employees? That is, when there's clearly no chance of a win-win scenario. So this is sort of the classic, I guess, shareholder versus stakeholder concern.
It's difficult because the manager actually is appointed by the shareholders. So the manager is accountable to the shareholders. And the question is, how far should you go into pleasing the shareholders? And at some point, the moral duty is going to come in, right? And that's the difficult. That's, in the end, there's something to be said about Smith plus Pigou. Pigou, you internalize the externalities, and then you can maximize profit, and that's the entire construct. You make the firm internalize the externality. You pay, a 100 euros carbon price, or 100 Canadian dollars carbon price, and then you don't have to think about that, because then you pay the cost for society, and then you can maximize profit. The problem arises when, the carbon tax, I don't know, well, I don't know what the carbon price in Canada is right now, but, it's insufficient. So as a manager, what do? Do you keep polluting to increase the profit of your shareholders, or you try to restrict pollution? I don't talk about posture. I mean, there's always greenwashing and the like, but, if you want to do serious stuff, what do? Do you disobey the shareholders, or do you, or do you pollute to maximize profit? And that's where, I mean, the theory tells you, well, it depends on how much you internalize social welfare. So that's something on which I don't have much to say, in a sense. That, and I mean, sure. I mean, you should stop polluting, but then you lose your jobs. And then you have a good replacement excuse, right? Because anyway, if I don't do it, then I'll lose my job, and then the next CEO will do it, right?
Two last questions, and then we'll wrap it up. This question comes again from a colleague here at the law school, Professor Francesco Ducci. Thanks for the presentation. You briefly mentioned privacy earlier on in your presentation, and he wonders if you could expand on the issue of data privacy as a potential source of market failure.
Okay, that's another interesting question. So privacy, actually, there are lots of market failures in privacy. The first is that we can basically give data. I mean, the firms, people can use our data without our consent for multiple reasons. They may cheat, or they may be hacked, so they don't invest enough in security, or else our social graph is going to give the data about us. So through their emails and their pictures and so on, they will reveal about health or political opinions and the like. So the other thing is that even if we give our consent, it may not be informed consent. And that's something I have trouble with GDPR, which, it's a nice thing, GDPR, but I keep on clicking on all websites without knowing the transaction costs are way too high, and I think it's not the right way to do it. So those are market failures, but also you have to explain why we are concerned about our data being around. So it might be price discrimination. So basically the platforms capturing our behavioral surplus. It could be we lose insurance in the health market. It could be things which have to do with, I'm doing some work on divisive issues. So think about sexuality, politics, religion, vaccines and whatnot. The fact that, if people can get very hostile or violent if you disagree with them on those issues, that may cost you a job too, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's this issue about how you protect yourself. Do you stop doing this behavior or speaking your mind, or do you take refuge in a safe space and so on? So this is something I'm currently working on. But the point is that the market for data fails, and we need to correct it. And I think we need a stronger regulator. It's not easy to do. I mean, I have to warn you, but it's not easy to do. But you need a stronger regulator. Think about banking. I think none of you actually spends his or her evening, nights, and days looking at the balance sheet or off balance sheet activity of their bank in order to take the money away if the bank is starting being in distress, right? That will be impossible to do, and that will be very inefficient to do. Unfortunately, we have a regulator doing that. If you think about, sorry, that must be your lunchtime. If you go to a restaurant after this seminar, you're not going to inspect the supply chain of the restaurant to see if you are going to get some poisonous food, right? Fortunately, there are regulators who do that for you. It's much more efficient. And for data, it's a little bit the same. So, you would think that for data, it's way too complex. When I click on a website, I hardly understand actually the privacy policy, and actually it's on purpose. I guess it's they make it very, very hard to understand. But then I certainly don't understand the privacy policy of the 150 websites or firms that are going to share their data with. The transaction costs will be tremendous. So we need better regulation. Okay, let me stop here because I believe there is another question, and probably you have other activities as well. So
yes, we're not going to be able to get to we got most of our questions there. I'm going to leave one unanswered because I know that we had a social bargain with our attendees that we would wrap up at 1:30. So we'll stop there. Professor Tirole, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that when things return to normal, we will be able to bring you to London in person to speak to us once again. But in the meantime, I very much appreciate your speaking to us today. Your presentation was excellent and insightful. And again, I'd recommend to all of the attendees there's a draft of the paper relating to what you talked about today, but you mentioned that you're revising it. So we'll post the appropriate link or signal to that revised version when it's ready. And in the meantime, thank you again for joining us and for being our 2021 Business and Law Scholar keynote lecturer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the honor and for the great question. It was a great event. Thank you so much.
And with that, we'll bring our proceedings to a close. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we look forward to the next event in our Business and Law series. Please keep attentive. I'll be posting something about that in the, I guess, weeks or months to come. Thank you again, everyone.